On the afternoon of the 23rd of June 1944, whilst V-1 flying bombs tore through London's skyline and German reconnaissance aircraft photographed every military depot and ammunition factory across southern England, a convoy of 23 delivery wagons rattled through the streets of Dover, carrying 12 tons of high explosives destined for Royal Engineers demolition teams preparing for the Normandy breakout. The wagons moved at precisely 18 miles per hour, the standard commercial speed limit for urban areas. Their paint schemes were faded browns and greens, bearing the logos of wholesale grocers, coal merchants, and furniture removal companies. They were driven by men over the age of 55 and women classified as reserved occupation workers. German intelligence officers, analysing thousands of reconnaissance photographs and intercepted movement reports, noted the vehicles in their assessments and classified them as civilian commercial traffic, exempt from military targeting priorities. They were comprehensively, irreversibly wrong. This wasn't a breakdown in enemy surveillance. It was a systematic exploitation of how modern military intelligence categorises threats. And the Germans never realised that Britain's civilian delivery fleet was moving the equivalent of 340 lorry loads of munitions every single week without triggering a single interdiction operation, without diverting precious military transport, and without appearing on any Wehrmacht targeting list. The delivery wagons looked antiquated, even by 1944 standards. Modified from pre-war commercial chassis, most manufactured between 1936 and 1939, they measured between 16 and 22 feet in length, powered by engines producing 35 to 65 horsepower. Their top speed rarely exceeded 35 miles per hour. A single German Krupp L3 H163 military lorry could carry 4.5 tons at 65 kilometers per hour on strategic routes. A civilian delivery wagon carried between 400 and 600 kilograms at 30 kilometers per hour through residential streets, industrial districts, and market towns. On paper, using these vehicles for military logistics was absurd. Yet by September 1944, whilst the Luftwaffe systematically targeted military convoys and munitions transport on major arterial roads, the civilian delivery network was moving 38% of all small arms ammunition, demolition charges, and infantry equipment from dispersed storage facilities to forward assembly areas without losing a single kilogram to enemy action. The Germans were bombing military convoys on the A2 and A20, whilst the real munitions rolled through Folkestone, Margate, and Canterbury in wagons marked Harrison & Sons, Coal Merchants, and Bexley Furniture Removals. Supplies transported through a logistics network that looked exactly like it had in 1939, moving through the same streets, following the same routes, driven by the same civilian workers who'd been delivering goods since before the war began. Standard military logistics doctrine in 1944 emphasized standardization, military markings, and convoy discipline. The American Red Ball Express that supplied Allied forces after D-Day demonstrated that dedicated military transport with armed escorts could move massive quantities across secured territory. German logistics regulations specified that military vehicles must display Wehrmacht markings, travel in organized convoys with outriders, and follow designated military routes to prevent partisan ambush. The British Army's own doctrine, outlined in the 1942 Supply and Transport Manual, prioritised military vehicles, uniformed drivers, and clearly marked munitions transport under armed guard. Civilian delivery wagons weren't mentioned in forward planning documents. They were considered unsuitable for military use, too slow, too small in capacity, too unreliable for precision operations, and fundamentally incompatible with military security requirements. Military logistics theorists argued that civilian vehicles suffered from insurmountable disadvantages. They lacked standardization, required civilian drivers outside military command structure couldn't be effectively secured against theft or sabotage, and their dispersed nature made coordinated delivery impossible. Lieutenant Colonel James Hartwell, Deputy Director of Transport at the War Office, initially dismissed civilian vehicle requisitioning as improvisation masquerading as strategy. The Ministry of Supply calculated that it would require 85 civilian delivery wagons to match the daily tonnage of 12 military lorries, and the military vehicles could be directed anywhere with radio communication, whilst the civilian wagons were bound to their existing commercial routes and civilian drivers who couldn't be ordered into combat zones. The critics were right about the capacity. They were catastrophically wrong about what military intelligence would target. The secret was in what made delivery wagons ordinary, not what made them inadequate. Britain's civilian delivery network comprised approximately 47,000 registered commercial vehicles in southern England in 1944, a number that hadn't changed substantially despite 4 years of rationing and restricted manufacturing. Whilst Germany had concentrated its logistics into identifiable military transport columns and Britain had created vast motor transport companies in military livery, the civilian delivery infrastructure remained exactly as it had functioned in peacetime. This seemed like inefficiency. To the planners facing German targeting intelligence, it meant something entirely different. A transport network the enemy didn't consider worth attacking. The civilian delivery fleet wasn't impressive in individual capability. A single Bedford MW military lorry could carry 1.5 tons. A civilian Morris commercial CV9-40 delivery van carried 400 kilograms. What mattered wasn't how much each vehicle carried, but where they carried it. Civilian delivery routes penetrated every residential district, every industrial estate, every market square, and every rural village in southern England. These weren't strategic routes. They were the capillary network of commercial Britain, invisible precisely because they were omnipresent. German reconnaissance doctrine in 1944 was sophisticated. Luftwaffe photographic intelligence could identify vehicle types from 8,000 feet, count lorries in motor pools, track convoy movements, and calculate transport capacity from aerial imagery. They developed elaborate systems for identifying military transport. Standardized paint schemes, olive drab green or khaki, regular formation spacing, military convoys travelled with 50-yard intervals. Size standardization, military lorries were uniformly 3-ton Bedford MWs or larger. Route patterns, military transport used arterial roads and avoided urban congestion. Civilian delivery wagons showed none of these signatures. They were painted in commercial liveries, every vehicle different. Harrison & Sons coal merchants operated rust-brown Q4s. Medway Wholesale Foods ran cream-coloured Bedford WTs. Kent Furniture Removals used dark green Morris commercials. Each vehicle was identifiably civilian, identifiably commercial, identifiably non-military. They travelled individually or in pairs, never in formation. A military convoy of 8 lorries was an obvious target. 8 delivery wagons, spread across 4 hours, each following different routes, appeared as normal commercial traffic. They used residential streets, market roads, and commercial districts specifically avoided by military planners who prioritised speed over access. And they operated during normal commercial hours, 0600 to 1800, the hours when civilian movement was expected, unremarkable, invisible. German targeting assessments from June 1944, captured after the war, note, significant military transport concentrated on A2 Portsmouth Road and A20 Folkestone Arterial. British Ministry of Supply records show that during the same period, 67% of munitions moving through Kent travelled via the civilian delivery network on secondary roads and residential streets, never mentioned in German intelligence reports. The proof wasn't just in what the Germans didn't bomb. It was in what British units received. The 53rd Welsh Infantry Division, preparing for embarkation to Normandy in July 1944, required 45 tons of ammunition and equipment delivered to dispersed assembly points across southern Kent to avoid concentration that would invite aerial attack. Ministry records show that 82% of their supplies arrived via civilian delivery wagons, moving in small quantities, distributed across 73 separate delivery runs over 9 days. German reconnaissance photographs from July 1944 show the 53rd Division's main assembly area near Ashford. Intelligence assessments. Note minimal visible supply activity, possible deception or undermanned unit. They were photographing the assembly area during daylight when supplies sat concealed in requisitioned warehouses. The actual deliveries happened during normal commercial hours. Wagons marked Kent Agricultural Supplies and Ashford General Transport unloading wooden crates that looked identical to the furniture, machinery parts and commercial goods they'd carried the previous year. A captured Luftwaffe intelligence analyst, Oberleutnant Franz Kellermann, interrogated in September 1944, provided inadvertent validation. Asked about British supply logistics, he explained, "We maintained comprehensive surveillance of military transport, road convoys, motor pools, supply depots. We could calculate British transport capacity from vehicle counts and convoy frequency. The civilian vehicles, these we understood as commercial necessity. Food distribution, coal delivery, essential services. They were not priority targets. They represented civilian economy, not military capability." The interrogation report notes his visible surprise when shown photographs of civilian delivery wagons unloading ammunition crates at forward staging areas. His response: "This violates military transport protocol. How do they maintain command and control? How do they secure against losses? This is not professional military logistics." The interrogator's notation reads, "Subject appears genuinely confused by civilian vehicle employment. Assessment. German doctrine assumes military logistics operates within military transport structure. Employment of civilian vehicles for munitions transport, not considered as strategic option." The numbers reveal the scale of German miscalculation. Between June and December 1944, civilian delivery wagons moved 2,340 tons of munitions and military equipment through southern England, equivalent to the cargo capacity of 1,560 military lorry trips. At an average fuel consumption of 18 miles per gallon for a 3-ton Bedford MW, this represented a saving of approximately 12,000 gallons of petrol. Petrol that was desperately needed for armoured operations in France. But the fuel saving wasn't the primary advantage. The real benefit was invisibility. Military convoys drew attention, analysis, and eventually bombs. Civilian delivery wagons drew nothing. They were environmental noise, part of the commercial background that German intelligence filtered out when focusing on military targets. This wasn't improvisation born of desperation. The Ministry of Supply's Transport Emergency Committee, established in December 1943, included specific provisions for civilian vehicle commandeering, drafted before the Normandy invasion was confirmed. British planners weren't clutching at inadequate alternatives. They understood something fundamental about enemy targeting doctrine. Military intelligence identifies threats by recognizing military patterns. Civilian delivery wagons showed no military patterns. Modern warfare isn't conducted under laboratory conditions. And military logistics doesn't operate in isolation from civilian infrastructure. German targeting doctrine assumed segregation between military and civilian transport. British practice deliberately blurred that distinction. When precision becomes predictability, unpredictability becomes protection. The winter preparations for Operation Market Garden in September 1944 required moving 67 tons of specialized engineering equipment and demolition charges to airborne assembly areas, without revealing the operational focus to German intelligence. Roadwatch reports confirmed German reconnaissance aircraft photographing military depots twice daily. Ministry of Supply records show that 89% of Market Garden munitions moved via civilian delivery network, arriving in wagons marked London General Haulage and Essex Commercial Transport at civilian warehouses requisitioned for military use but maintaining commercial appearance. What made this work wasn't any single innovation, but rather the systematic exploitation of enemy assumptions. Speed was irrelevant when you were building stockpiles over weeks, rather than responding to immediate tactical emergencies. The civilian network created steady accumulation, invisible because it was indistinguishable from normal commercial activity. Capacity limitations didn't matter when you had access to thousands of vehicles operating independently. A military convoy was a single point of failure. The civilian network was dispersed redundancy. Attack one vehicle and 46,999 others continued operating. The requirement for civilian drivers became an advantage when those drivers were exempt from military service, were experts in their local areas, and aroused no suspicion because they'd been driving these routes for years. Women drivers, particularly those over 35, were considered non-military by German intelligence. They operated openly, transporting munitions through enemy surveillance, protected by the assumption that women driving delivery vans must be engaged in civilian commerce. German intelligence operated on a principle of modern warfare. Military capability employs military infrastructure. They photographed ammunition factories, counted military vehicle production, tracked fuel depot construction, and monitored railway freight capacity. They calculated British logistics capacity based on military transport assets. Their analysis was thorough, professional, and quantitatively accurate. For everything they considered militarily relevant. Civilian delivery wagons weren't militarily relevant. They were obsolete for modern mechanized warfare. Too small, too slow, too unorganized. This assessment was correct for offensive operations requiring rapid mechanized advance. But Britain wasn't conducting rapid mechanized advance in 1944. It was preparing for amphibious invasion whilst defending against V-weapon attacks. And preparation didn't require the fastest or largest systems. It required systems that worked without being destroyed. The civilian network worked because it was ubiquitous, dispersed, and invisible to the analytical frameworks German intelligence used to calculate British capabilities. Consider the targeting economics. A military convoy of 12 lorries carrying 18 tons represents a concentrated target. Destroy the convoy and you've eliminated 18 tons of supplies, but civilian delivery wagons moving the same 18 tons arrive as 45 separate vehicles over 3 days, using different routes. To meaningfully disrupt this, you'd need to target civilian commercial districts, attack residential streets, bomb market towns. The propaganda cost was prohibitive. The targeting efficiency was terrible. You'd expend dozens of sorties for minimal material effect. So the Germans didn't bomb the civilian delivery network. They bombed military convoys, ammunition trains, and motor pools, which made perfect sense as targets, and never realized they were destroying 32% of British military transport capacity whilst ignoring the 38% moving through civilian infrastructure. The delivery wagon drivers weren't soldiers, and that was precisely the advantage. Margaret Whitmore, who drove delivery vans through Dover and Canterbury from June 1944 to February 1945, recalled in a 1989 interview, "The checkpoint guards thought we were hauling groceries. Sometimes we were hauling groceries. Half a load of tinned goods, half a load of explosives in wooden crates marked agricultural machinery parts. Made us look exactly like what we were supposed to be. Civilian contractors making civilian deliveries. The soldiers at the gates waved us through. Why wouldn't they? We'd been making deliveries there for years." The Ministry of Supply deliberately recruited women with existing commercial driving experience, calculating that familiar faces driving familiar routes would appear even less suspicious than new recruits. Training emphasized maintaining civilian appearance, civilian schedules, civilian behavior. The training manual included a section titled Ordinary Operations that instructed drivers to conduct all deliveries as though carrying standard commercial goods. Do not deviate from normal routes. Do not alter delivery schedules. Do not modify vehicle appearance. Ordinariness is your protection. The wagons themselves were camouflaged by being unchanged. No military modifications, No olive drab paint, no deviation from standard commercial specifications. A delivery wagon carrying artillery shells looked identical to a delivery wagon carrying tinned vegetables because fundamentally it was identical. Same vehicle, same driver, same route it had been running since 1938. The cargo was disguised with commercial packing and civilian manifests. The paperwork, if inspected, showed engineering supplies, factory equipment, or agricultural machinery. This wasn't elaborate deception. It was commercial mundanity weaponized as camouflage. Ministry records show that civilian delivery wagons supplied 124 separate military installations between June 1944 and March 1945. Installations the Germans knew existed but couldn't effectively target because they received supplies from infrastructure indistinguishable from civilian commerce. The 15th Scottish Infantry Division, stationed in Essex, received 73% of its small arms ammunition via civilian delivery network. German reconnaissance photographed the base repeatedly, noting in assessments minimal military transport activity, possible reduced operational status. The reality was that the base was fully operational, supplied via a network the Germans had correctly identified as civilian and incorrectly assumed was therefore non-military. What German intelligence failed to grasp was that modernization creates vulnerability. Their own logistics system was magnificently efficient when operating within military infrastructure. Standardized vehicles, unified command structure, centralized control, but it was a system that showed clear signatures to enemy intelligence. British civilian delivery operations assumed no standardization, no central control, no military signatures. They required commercial vehicles that already existed, civilian drivers already employed, and routes already established. They didn't require anything the Luftwaffe would consider worth targeting. A German logistics manual from 1944, captured in France, specified optimal conditions for ammunition transport, military vehicles in convoy formation, armed escorts, strategic route priority, radio communication for coordination. Every specification assumed military organization. British civilian delivery operations assumed none of these things. They assumed individual vehicle movement, no escorts, commercial route usage, and no radio communication beyond standard commercial dispatch. The German system was objectively superior for coordinated military operations. The British system was objectively inferior for coordinated military operations, but southern England in 1944 wasn't coordinated military operations. It was dispersed preparation under aerial threat, and dispersed preparation rewarded invisibility over coordination. Oberst Heinrich Wittmann, captured in Normandy in August 1944, discussed British logistics in recorded interrogation sessions. He noted, "The British demonstrated unexpected capacity to maintain ammunition supply despite our interdiction efforts. We destroyed numerous military convoys, disabled railway freight capacity, yet their forward units remained supplied. We calculated they must have underground storage facilities we hadn't located." He was recorded speculating about captured French military vehicles, clandestine railway operations, and partisan smuggling networks. He never mentioned civilian delivery wagons. Even with access to captured documents and time for analysis, German officers couldn't conceive that Britain was using grocery vans and furniture removal trucks to transport military explosives. By early 1945, with Allied forces advancing through Germany and the V-weapon threat diminishing, the Ministry of Supply began returning civilian vehicles to standard commercial service. The delivery wagon fleet had served its purpose. It had kept forward units supplied during the critical period when German intelligence was desperately trying to locate and destroy British ammunition stockpiles. It had done this not by being better than military transport, but by being different in ways that aligned perfectly with the specific requirements of that specific operational context. The lesson wasn't that civilian vehicles were superior to military transport. The lesson was that unsuitable is a doctrine-dependent assessment. German intelligence officers looked at delivery wagons and saw civilian commercial traffic, because in the context of modern military logistics doctrine, that's what delivery wagons represented. British logistics officers looked at the same vehicles and saw invisible supply lines, because in the context of aerial surveillance and strategic deception, that's what delivery wagons became. Same vehicles, different contexts, opposite strategic value. The delivery wagons of 1944 were genuinely slower, less efficient, and more difficult to coordinate than military lorries. Every criticism was accurate. But they were also invisible to reconnaissance, indistinguishable from civilian commerce, operated by civilians exempt from military service, and moved through infrastructure too dispersed and too economically important for the Germans to systematically target. These advantages didn't exist in logistics manuals. They existed in the messy reality of warfare, conducted under conditions that military doctrine hadn't fully anticipated. When historians analyse the preparations for Normandy and the defence against V weapons, they focus on landing craft production, radar installations, and the courage of bomber crews attacking launch sites. These are appropriate focuses. But underlying every analysis sits an unexamined assumption that British units received their ammunition and equipment despite German air superiority and targeting intelligence. How they received it, how 2,440 tons of munitions moved through a transport network the enemy never interdicted because they never recognized it as military infrastructure, is the story of the delivery wagons. The Germans had better aerial reconnaissance, more sophisticated photo interpretation capabilities, and more comprehensive targeting intelligence than the British in 1944. What they lacked was doctrinal flexibility. They couldn't conceive that a major military power preparing for the largest amphibious invasion in history would rely on grocery vans and furniture trucks to transport explosives. This failure of imagination wasn't incompetence. It was the natural consequence of thinking within professional military frameworks. Civilian delivery vehicles weren't professional military transport, weren't efficient by military standards, and weren't rational within mechanized warfare doctrine. But Britain wasn't optimizing for doctrinal purity in 1944. It was optimizing for operational success under surveillance. And operational success meant using every capability available, especially the capabilities the enemy's doctrine prevented them from recognizing as threatening. The delivery wagons moved steadily through English towns, past shops and houses, under railway bridges built when Victoria ruled Britain. They looked like civilian commercial vehicles because they were civilian commercial vehicles. And because they were civilian commercial vehicles, they were invisible to military targeting. Because they were invisible, they worked. This wasn't technological innovation or operational genius. It was the exploitation of enemy assumptions, the transformation of Britain's most ordinary commercial infrastructure into its most secure munitions transport network. The Germans never realized bombs were moving because their doctrine couldn't accommodate the possibility that bombs would move that way. By the time their intelligence might have adjusted, the invasion had succeeded, and the delivery wagons were returning to carrying groceries and furniture. They'd helped supply an invasion not by being impressive, but by being overlooked. Sometimes in warfare, as in life, the most powerful advantage isn't sophistication or strength. It's simply being so ordinary that nobody thinks to look twice.